Good afternoon. The January 20th meeting of the Oklahoma City Water Utilities Trust will be in order. First item on the agenda is the approval of the January 6th meeting minutes.
Move approval.
Second.
A motion and a second to approve the minutes. Are there comments, questions, additions, corrections? Hearing none. Voting, please. Minutes are approved. Next item is the consent docket.
Move consent docket subject to individual consideration.
Second.
Do we have matters to be considered separately?
Mr. Chairman, I have a couple of minor questions on 3G. This is one where a project overran the number of days scheduled, and there was some penalty suffered by the contractor. How much was that, and what happened to the money?
Councilman, I'm so sorry. I'm having trouble hearing today. Could you repeat which of the item?
It's item 3G.
G, thank you. So the issue with that was really logistics of the site. We were working at a confined space. There was a lot of truck traffic.
You know, I have no problem with the project at all. But there was some money collected as a penalty.
And we didn't specify it in the memo.
What happened to the money? You know, how much was it?
I will get you that information. I'm so sorry. It was not in the memo.
Did it reduce the overall cost of the project?
Yes.
Yeah, the total amount for the liquidated damages was $11,000, and it was subtracted from the overall contract amount.
Okay, I didn't see that when we had the original contract and revised contract amount. There were several decreases, but I didn't see one. I'm sorry if I overlooked it.
Mr. Chairman, often that is tallied up in final acceptance documents. Where what we have before us is an amendment and change order. So we just talked to the technical changes. But yes, that number should appear in your final acceptance.
Thank you.
I thought you said you had two.
Well, I have another one, but maybe it's this is number 3I.
Yes, sir.
And it has to do with the relocation of a cable antenna. And it says the staff has identified locations that T-Mobile could perhaps construct a tower and relocate the antenna. Do we do that for everybody when we have a lease? It seems like we're using, city employees to do something that T-Mobile should have done.
When we have a lease that we'd like to vacate, we try to work with the customer if we have other options immediately available for the customer. We're trying to accommodate a long-term lease agreement and take down the tower at 6th and Penn.
But the locations that city people were looking at were all on city property?
Yes, sir.
All city facilities?
Yes, not acquiring any additional land and looking for a more convenient place out of the way of our parking facilities at Line Maintenance.
Now, would we reconstruct a tower there solely for T-Mobile, or would we build a water tower?
They will build their own tower, and we will tear down the tank that at the Oberholzer, at the Line Maintenance facility that's associated with the Oberholzer plant that's been out of service for a couple of decades.
The tank at Overholser is aesthetically challenged.
Pardon me?
It's aesthetically challenged.
Yes, it is. If there needs paint there desperately.
Any other questions on the consent docket? Voting, please. Consent docket's approved. Next item is the concurrence docket. One item.
Move the item.
Second.
Motion and a second on the concurrence docket. Questions? Voting, please. Concurrent docket's approved. Next item. Items for individual consideration. First item is a resolution authorizing and approving a drinking water state revolving fund loan.
Is that, Mr. Chairman, that part of your financial plan includes borrowing funds through the Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund, and the subsequent item, the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. This is intended to fund a portion of this year's entire water capital program.
What kind of rate do we pay on this?
We get a AAA credit rating. I'm going to turn to Brett. It is a discounted price.
The rates that we would charge are competitive with the rates that we're paying right now. What the difference is that this state revolving loan and the clean water loan do not require us to borrow an extra 10% to put inside of a bond reserve fund, so we're borrowing less proceeds. So they're financially feasible for us, more beneficial to use as much of these as we can at the rate that we're charging.
I think we ought to use these very carefully because we're getting a good buy, and good interest rate and good situation. However, every time we take money out of this fund, there's some small community that doesn't have our financial flexibility that is, foregone from getting that money. So I think we need to be careful about how we use these.
Further comments? We have a motion on 5B, do we?
5A.
A.
Second.
Okay. Motion and a second to approve. Voting, please. The next item is B.
And again, this is a small loan, $800,000 from the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund, which is the wastewater side of the house. Most of the remainder of the wastewater capital program this year will be funded with cash.
Move approval.
Second.
A motion and a second to approve item 5B. Further comments? Voting, please. B is approved.
Mr. Chairman, might be appropriate to recognize our long-term bond counsels in the audience today, Gary Bush, who's been, how long have you been servicing the trust, Gary? Quite a while. Okay.
We do not need executive session, is that right?
That's correct.
I move to strike.
A motion to strike. Item C, stricken. Items from trustees. General manager report, status report.
So, Mr. Chairman, just quickly, a financial status report for you that the long and short of is the water and wastewater funds are about $1 million behind in total income, as is common this year, but fund balances are actually better than forecast by a couple of $1 million. So it's kind of a net sum game we're perfectly fine, and this condition is normal in a moderately wet, yet droughted year. Happy to answer questions about item A, if you'd like to move on to the, pardon me, I think and on item A. How embarrassing.
I had a thought about on the lake level portion of this, that it might be well that the report include a percentage of the capacity which is the trigger for rationing.
We will so do.
To have it, if it's not on, is a combined, I mean, you could figure it out, I think, but if we just put it in a number in the report, I think, maybe up here in the headline, under the,
Yes.
where it talks about the precipitation and so forth.
Happy to add that.
Plug it in there.
We're at just under 52% accessible storage today. We'll be seeing a little rain over the next several weeks. We may not change from roughly 52%, but staff is preparing for the threshold of the next layer of conservation, which begins at 50%.
Excuse me, Matt, I think we ought to make a real effort to communicate to our citizens that is in effect, that we're getting close to it, and that at 50%, whatever relates to 52% now, that we need to make them aware of the fact that there's going to be a change in our philosophy as far as watering is concerned. We're going to move from every other day to some kind of a twice a week kind of schedule, whatever you.
It is we go from every other day to twice a week.
But I think we need to make a
Yes,
real
sir.
effort to communicate that to the citizens. So
We will.
Have we, if we have to go to the next level, just walk through for me how quickly we will be, what we'll do. Let's just say that we estimate that by February 1, they'll hit the 5.0, and we'll have to do it. How will we implement it? What will happen next?
So we have access to media ads through existing contracts that we can begin to employ. We have a visual image, VI branding, working with us on mailers for customers, on short videos that go on the web and also on TV about that change. It is always a tough transition to catch everyone, and so we'll be working on streamers that go on TV. Another piece of the plan is streamers that go across your TV screen to help remind folks. It's a big change. It'll start with a postcard. Will be the first piece of mail that you'll see.
And how will you enforce that?
Enforcement will be with temporary assignments of employees in vehicles. We'll also be taking, through the webpage, squeezeeverydrop.com, and through oklc.gov, we take reports from folks about failure to conserve and follow up on those.
Communications, we would have the amount of penalty that they
Yes.
would be assessed if indeed they violated the regulation.
Yes.
How much lead time would the public have before the conservation level would change?
We certainly have a couple of weeks if we don't get any rain. Today we have a couple of weeks where we're physically, I've authorized printing the postcards that will go to customers today, just getting ready and knowing that we can keep those for another time if we don't hit 50%.
Well, I think we're as close as we are. I think we as Councilman Ryan says, I think we're close enough that we need to kick the media piece of it in.
We will so do. Thank you for your feedback.
Next item is the monthly pro forma, item 7B.
Yes, and again, because I ran at the mouth, we're a couple of $1 million ahead on income, even though we're a little bit on net income, even though we're a little bit behind on our forecast. We have seen a decline in the number of, back to item A, we've seen a decline in the number of water meters sold. We believe that's because we, in December of last year, added 200 or 300 water meters for one apartment complex in that month. So we're working to normalize that data as we promised we would. But generally, meter sales are good for this time of year.
Okay, the last item under General Manager reports is a presentation by Montgomery Watson Harza concerning Tinker's municipalization.
Mr. Chairman, this is Jared Stiggy with Guernsey.
Thank you for your time this afternoon. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about where we stand in the process. I think our slide should be coming up here shortly so I can talk to it. The first slide is the one that you've seen in the previous presentations, and it lays out where we are in the process. We're still in phase one, and we're currently right at about halfway through phase one, which is the procurement phase leading to negotiations and potentially contract award. On the page with the graph of the work plan, we are currently at the rightmost red stars, which is today here talking with you about pricing, and that represents about an 85% project complete status as of today. Moving on to talk about our pricing work, this is the meat and potatoes of what I'm here to talk with you today. The principle that we're moving forward in working with the trust staff to develop this price proposal is developing a good cost to serve tanker that does not require any subsidization from existing ratepayers. The price we put forward will be evaluated by the Defense Logistics Agency, Energy, and they employ two tests when they're looking to see whether the deal is acceptable from the federal government side. The first test is they must receive market value for the utility systems. We will propose a fair market value. They may counter. That will be a negotiated item in the negotiations that will take place this summer. The second test is that they need to find that there is long-term cost avoidance to the federal government. And cost avoidance is different than savings. And the reason they use the term cost avoidance is because they are currently spending very little money on their utility systems out there. They have a huge backlog of capital projects that have not been completed. They don't perform preventive maintenance as they should. And so if the expectation was that Tinker is going to save money by municipalizing their systems, they would never get there. The reason they've come to you is because they do have this large backlog of capital work that needs to be done, and they do not have sufficient staff in order to perform the maintenance they need to perform. And so the test, I'm actually getting a little bit ahead of myself, but the test they will be looking at, if you move to the next slide, is what they consider a should cost. The should cost starts with their existing cost as a baseline of what their historical experience has been. But then they say, well, on top of what we have been spending, what should we be spending to operate our utility at an industry standard? And so they will increase their capital expenditures to cover for all the capital projects that have not been completed, and they will increase their O&M costs to add the positions and add these service contracts and add all those maintenance activities that they should be performing on their system in order to provide utility-grade service. And so it's that should cost, or their hypothetical cost, that the trust's bid will be compared to determine whether or not it represents a long-term economic value to the federal government. Any questions about that part? I know it's kind of, I live in this world, so it makes sense to me, but it probably sounds a little convoluted.
I have a question. It says that the DOD must receive fair market value for the system.
Correct.
How do you establish a fair market value for a system that has millions of dollars worth of unaccomplished infrastructure and is years behind in its maintenance, and it's all located on land that you're not going to give up title to? How do you determine a value for that? It seems to me that has no value.
Well, or $1 was a popular value that used to be used for these transactions, but Congress got involved and they slapped the hands of the parties that were making those transactions. It's actually in the government's best interest to set the transaction as low as possible, because since they are going to be essentially a customer class of one, whatever you pay for the system, you need to recover from that customer. So it's really in everybody's best interest for it to be as low as possible. And so the method that we have been using is replacement cost new, less depreciation. So, for example, if they've got a water line out there that has a service life of 50 years and it's been in the ground for 60, we give that a $0 value. In addition to that, there may be assets that still have a useful life or design life left in them, but are considered to be of no value to the trust for some reason. An example would be lift stations. They've got 52 lift stations out there, and we would like to eliminate as many of those as possible. And so from our perspective, we don't value those lift stations as having an economic value, because they're actually a liability for the way the trust would like to operate the wastewater system. So those case-by-case assets we can assign a $0 value to as well. And so we'll combine all those considerations into one fair market value that we'll propose to the government, and then that will be a negotiated item.
I'll be interested to see what you come up with, but it's just hard for me to imagine there being a positive value when you accumulate it. For the example you gave about a pipeline that has a 50-year useful life and it's been there 60 years, it's almost like you ought to put -1 rather than 0.
I agree, because you got to...
It's a ticking bomb as far as we're concerned.
Yeah. Well, and we can work with your staff to develop as low of a rationally supported fair market value as we can. I know that we would love to go to $1, but the federal government doesn't really allow that anymore. But to the greatest extent that we can justify the lowest value possible, we can put that forward in good faith as our initial negotiating position, and then just see where things go from there.
You can't go below 0 is what you're telling me.
Not under current law. If you have some friends in D.C., we could change the law and maybe get some other consideration. But right now, it has to be at least $1 for the entire system. And really, they're going to be looking for something higher than that.
Well, I've been in my home for...
Excuse me?
We could actually come with a number higher than $1?
Yes, the draft number we have right now is higher than $1 because we are using that replacement cost new, less depreciation, and less impairments to come up with the fair market value.
How about the projects that they proposed that they haven't completed? How will they be included in your?
Yeah, those would have a $0 value also. So the overall system is over 80% depreciated, so when you look at the entire system, the remaining value in that system is quite low, but it is higher than $1 because they have done
Maybe $2, is that what?
Exactly. They have done some recent projects out there that will have some continuing benefit should the trust take over the systems.
Now, Marcia, will the contract we have with Tinker, if we indeed get that far, will it require the Tinker to participate in our water conservation plans?
Yes,
So, as
to the extent we can legally enforce against with the federal government.
We'll need to identify different uses. The uses that are necessary for public defense and safety would be handled differently than those that might be related to aesthetics and grass and landscaping.
because they do have some, they used to have anyway, I guess they still do, some quarters out there that were, like a housing complex that would have, only a use in terms of aesthetics. It wouldn't be any kind of national defense use.
Right, we'll have to distinguish those uses.
The current draft of the proposal that we have does require them to comply with those conservation principles. And in fact, even if we're using the well water at Tinker, we're not exempting them just because they happen to be on their own water system. We're requiring those conservation practices whether they are on their well water or if they move to purchasing water from the trust. Move on to pricing proposals. So the pricing proposals address three main things. The first thing, which isn't listed on this slide, is the fair market value. And as Bob reminded me, I should mention that the fair market value is something that is completely recovered from Tinker. And in fact, the way it's structured, it's a no-cash transaction. We will propose a period over which that purchase price will be recovered from the government, and it matches up to a credit that is given on their bill each month. And so essentially it's no cash changes hands. We charge them through the rate the recovery of the purchase price, and rather than giving them one lump sum payment up front, we give them a series of payments that exactly equal the amount that's being recovered so that it is a no cash transaction. That's something that's accepted by the federal government routinely. The other two elements that the pricing proposals address are the capital costs to provide the capital improvements projected over 50 years. That includes the initial system deficiency corrections, which are the items that the Tinker has identified as being out of either code compliance or not meeting their Air Force utility service requirements. It includes capital upgrades, which are items that the trust has identified that it would like to perform in order to operate the systems more efficiently. An example of that would be installing SCADA on a lot of their wells, which they don't have currently. The third item is renewals and replacements. That is just simply replacing their aged infrastructure that has either exceeded its useful life or, as you move through the contract, that will be exceeding its useful life as the years go by. And then the last item included in that are some types of system characterization studies that are allowed to be placed into the capital plan. Then smaller than capital, but no less important, is the O&M costs over 50 years, and that is the annual projected labor costs, vehicle and equipment costs, materials, and any service subcontracts that might be required. All these costs will be combined and submitted in a regulated tariff price proposal. And the benefit to you is that it allows you to establish a rate and then administer that rate much like you do with your current rate payers. So we are putting forward a price proposal to the government because federal law requires that they do a life cycle cost analysis and analyze the price so that they can determine whether it's economically feasible. In order to make the comparison between the government case and your proposal, we have to both sides have to build certain pricing assumptions into their economic cost projections. So, for example, 40 years from now, who knows whether we'll still be using the same types of infrastructure to deliver water to facilities. But for the purpose of creating a 50-year financial pro forma that we can compare against the government's 50-year look ahead, we have to make some simplifying assumptions. And so those are built in to the price proposal. What those do is those create a level of budgetary expenditure that the Air Force will expect to pay over the coming years. But the actual rate that will be charged to the Air Force will be based upon a regulated cost of service model where we record the costs that are incurred to directly serve Tinker, and those costs are aggregated, and then annually they are evaluated to see whether the current rates are sufficient to provide for full recovery of the cost from Tinker and to protect your existing ratepayers from subsidies. If the existing rates are fine, we leave the rates alone. If the existing rates are insufficient to make the recoveries that are necessary, there's a process to increase those rates on an annual basis or more frequently if necessary, but typically annual would be the shortest time frame that you'd want. In addition to recovering costs through the rates, you will also have a contract, a federal contract with the government. There will be contractual remedies for you for certain items that could come up. For example, Tinker is a Superfund site, and there's contamination, subsurface contamination that's not known. If an installing contractor is digging to install a new main or to replace an old one, and they discover subsurface contamination that's not known, that is obviously going to result in greatly increased costs to the project. That's an item that you can isolate and take to the federal contracting officer once your costs are quantified and recover that directly from the federal government without having to fold that into the rate. Or, if you prefer, you could accrue those costs and incorporate them into the utility rate at the next rate adjustment. So I guess the summary of what I'm trying to explain is that we are putting forward costs, and we are going to put forward 50 years of what we are proposing to charge the government. But the actual costs that will be charged to the government as you move through this contract will be based either on your cost of service or upon any contractual remedies that you might identify and be entitled to. Any questions about that? All right. So to close it up and say where we're headed from here, we're working together with your staff to finalize the pricing information over the next 30 days. We have a deadline to submit the proposal in the middle of March to the federal government. And so we've largely completed our technical reviews and analyses, and that's allowing us to now complete the pricing. There's a large amount of capital improvements that need to be done in the initial years, and we're currently working together with your staff to identify strategies to smooth that work over an appropriate period of time so that we're not biting off more work than we or the contracting community can accomplish, and so that we're not tearing up so much of the installation at one time that it causes problems for Tinker and its missions out there. And then lastly, just to reinforce that Tinker will be taking service as a customer of the trust, and although they will have a standalone contract that will in some ways inform your relationship with them, the economic model for recovery of costs from Tinker is cost of service through rates that are approved by the trust, and other than that, it would be through any contractual remedies that could be pursued by the trust with the contracting officer. And that's the essence of my presentation today, but if you have any additional questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Any questions?
How do you think the negotiations are going so far? Is Tinker anxious to take our service?
Well, I'll tell you, overall, the military would prefer not to convey their systems. They like to own and have control over them because they are a military and control is what they like. But they are so short on funds, not just at Tinker, but throughout all their installations, that they're really looking for ways to get as much of this old infrastructure replaced with the budget they have. And so the way they've typically funded things in the past is if they need a new $30 million worth of lines out at Tinker, Congress would appropriate that amount of money, lump sum, and provide it to the Corps of Engineers for them to execute that contract. What they're looking for in these conveyances, in these municipalizations and privatizations, is if they've only got $30 million to spend, they can get a lot more work done if they leverage their money and convey those systems to municipalities or to private sector companies that can finance, and therefore the government's, instead of having to pay for the 100% of the capital up front, they're only paying for the depreciation and debt service or rate of return on those assets. So honestly, if it were up to them and they could get all the appropriations they needed, they wouldn't be doing this. This is really, they've got 2 very old systems out there that need a lot of capital, and the trust is going to be the best opportunity for them to get those in good shape. All right, thanks.
Any other questions?
All right, thank you.
Comments? Any comments from trust? Are there citizens to be heard?
Mr. Chairman, I have just one more thing. We have, since your last meeting, received pricing for your bond issuance, for which we'll get proceeds the first week of February. The weighted average maturity, the average maturity is 19.7 years. The average yield on the weighted maturity is 2.57. The true interest cost was 3.43%. PFM advises that compares favorably with the bond sale 2 years ago when our true interest cost was 3.009%. Because of the length of the bonds, these have an average maturity of 19.7 years. The previous bonds were at 14.9. PFM will be here at your next meeting to give you an update on the details of the sale.
Any other comments? Thank you. We're adjourned.